Hello, and welcome to the Say Yes to Holiness podcast. I'm Christina Simmons, your host, and I am so glad that you joined me for conversation today because my guest is Jared Zimmerer. And for those of you who might not know him, he works with Word on Fire, but I'll kind of let him introduce himself and what it is that he's about. But Jared, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you today.
Absolutely. My pleasure to connect and really looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, super. Well, one of the things, so I'm going through a series right now and talking to the different OSV or Sunday Visitor Innovation Talk speakers. And you gave a wonderful talk about Bruce Lee as a master evangelist. And so I've been a Bruce Lee fan, so it kind of caught my eye and I listened to it. And I'm like, I need to talk to Jared. And so I was lucky enough to be able to connect with you. But first, though, I want to kind of find out what's been your journey of how it is that you came to where you are right now and what it is that you're doing. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, happy to. So I was born and raised in a very Catholic home. My father was a cradle Catholic. My mother actually converted to Catholicism when I was getting my first communion as a young kid. Catholic grade school, Catholic high school. My parents actually owned and operated a Catholic bookstore for about 15 years in my childhood. So family rosaries, monthly confessions, all of that stuff was a very normal thing for me. But to be completely honest with you, in large part during my childhood, up until about 16 or 17 years old, my main focus was sports. That's really all I cared about. I went to mass, was a good Catholic boy, but I mostly cared about sports. But then through actually an injury playing football, that potential of going past high school ended up getting kind of taken away from me. And I always loved my faith. I was always proud to be a Catholic, never even once thought about leaving Catholicism. But I did have a few moments there where I just kind of drifted away to where I would still go to mass, but it just didn't really mean that much to me. And during that time, I'm still, obsessed with sports. I ended up, still beginning to play a couple more sports, got into powerlifting, got into bodybuilding, in large part because of the knee injury. And that's also when I got into martial arts. I started practicing Jeet Kune Do, which is actually Bruce Lee's martial art, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and boxing, and a couple of other things, some mixed martial arts stuff. And so I've always kind of had this competitive spirit. I've actually gotten in a cage with a professional MMA fighter and sparred. And so I love that world. And so my introduction to Bruce Lee, of course, was through his movies. But then my sophomore year of college, I met a girl who is now my wife, and had kind of a major moment where, at that time it was just kind of about the next college party or the next workout or whatever it was going to be the rest of my day. But I didn't really think about life's big questions all that much. And by the grace of God and the upbringing my family gave me, I almost immediately went right into the catechism, and of course started with the Stoics, moved my way back into Fulton Sheen, Thomas Aquinas, and the like, because I started to kind of think like I'm getting very serious with this girl, and I don't want to enter into something still acting like a kid. And so, but when I had that moment, I had to kind of take a step back and think about my passions like bodybuilding, powerlifting, martial arts. How does that fit in, to Catholicism? There's not a lot of bodybuilding saints or a lot of, things like that. Now I'm actually hearing more and more samurai saints, which is pretty awesome. But I was trying to figure out what that meant. And so my undergrad degree is actually in kinesiology. I thought that I would go into coaching and teach maybe Spanish. I spent a lot of time down in Mexico City doing some things. And so that was my original intent, but God has a funny way of kind of leading us other ways. And I started working for my father selling insurance right around my time of my graduation, and then started speaking on particularly theology of the body. And I was trying to do it more for the young athletes, how to understand sports and discipline and how Christian spirituality and that reality can meld very, very well. That you learn physically what your spirit is asking for. So how to learn those things, and how sort of de-Cartesianize the reality of the modern world, and bring people back into their bodies, and realize that competitive spirit is actually a really good thing, and that it just needs to be aimed properly, and that there is a place in the will of God for sports and all of this great things. And so that kind of brought me into my work now. And I worked at a parish here in Texas for a little over 4 years. And during that time, I was getting my master's in theology. I actually wrote my thesis on Thomas Merton, particularly in regard to asceticism. And so I think with sports and all of that stuff, it just kind of fit really well with that. And then Bishop Barron, of course, hired me here for about 4 or 5 years ago. And so been here ever since. And yeah, it's just been an interesting kind of journey where I knew I never wanted to let go of my passions, the things that I love, like martial arts and these things. But it wasn't really until I started listening to Bishop Barron himself talking about the necessity of culture and evangelization, and how those two things can gel really, really well, and how rather than leading with this kind of fearful thought about something like, in bodybuilding, of course, there's going to be vanity and some issues involved, but there's still some great things in that culture, and great people in that culture. And so when I started kind of thinking about martial arts, and a lot of my heroes, many of whom are just secular people, they're not, all, I have my saint heroes, of course, but a lot of them that influenced me as a child and influenced me as I became, getting into my manhood and marriage, and now as a father, people who still influence me a lot. And so my journey is kind of a bit of a mixture of sports and grace, I guess.
Yeah, no, and I can attest, having been a lifelong athlete, I done multi-sport, done Ironman, half Ironmans, marathons, that kind of thing. And you're absolutely right of where that competitiveness, that desire to strive to be the best that we can be, is a huge component of our spiritual life.
Mm-hmm.
And that desire is there for a reason. God uses it to draw us closer to Him always. So it's you made mention about Bishop Barron and him hiring you, and not to get us off topic, but just very briefly, my word on fire. What was it that really appealed to you about what it is that you're striving to do right now?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was, to begin with, it was a lot of his movie reviews, the way he would do that. There was somebody who I could tell loved movies.
Right.
It wasn't trying to spiritualize it. It wasn't trying to, put it down for any reason. It was just, here's what I came out of that movie with. So it's this appreciation of culture. That was, I guess, the initial thing. But then also, I wrote a little short book on how weightlifting and Catholic spirituality can meld.
Right.
And the CEO of Word on Fire is Father Steve Grunow, who is also a big weightlifter. And so he actually brought me up to Mundelein whenever Father Barron was the rector there, and I got to speak to the seminarians about physical fitness and masculinity, and how to get into parish life without losing your health, and things like that, because of the demands that it happens to priests. And so that was the beginning of the relationship. But in large part, it was they taught me, or gave me a view of how to use culture to evangelize, not to create this us versus them reality, regardless of who it is, but rather to find what he calls the seeds of the word, find the little places of truth where you can kind of use that to reveal greater truths, and also show how it ultimately points to truth itself in Jesus Christ. And so even in my little loves of martial arts and all that stuff, it was still able to find those little moments where the truth of Christ can still be found, and then to be able to speak to that and through that. I just think that in the modern world, syllogisms and arguments and stuff like that, we need them. We need apologetics, but to do it culturally, to get into movies and music and the things that people love, I think honestly that's the way evangelization needs to work today. We need to get into those arenas, those cultures that people love, and speak to them through them, not against them, not us versus them, but rather in it with them.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in your talk, you made the statement, and I wrote it down. It was like, you cannot evangelize a culture that you do not love. And I think you were just speaking to that reality of where we have to see that. I speak to people all the time about the fact that there's your three layers of your vocation. There's, the master call to holiness, of course, for each of us to be a saint. We do it within our particular state of life. But then there's that personal mission that only you can do, because only you are who and what you are and where you are. So only you, Jared, could be in the bodybuilding world and be that witness of Christ to those people that you are encountering. No one else could do it, exactly like you are. And I think sometimes we view our faith as, I need to set aside my passions in order to like get serious about my faith. It's like, no, that's exactly where God desires for you to bring the faith and to embody it in a holistic way, to show people, no, I'm fully alive because I'm doing exactly what God created me to do. And and I think there's so much opportunity there for people to come to that awareness of, as you shared, what are my passions? So we were speaking before, we got on the podcast, and we were just talking about, those passions, and Rene Girard and the Medic desire, and our wanting. What is it that we want? And our desires, are there, but it's for us to come to an awareness of what they are and understand them, so that then we're able to put them again at the service of what we're supposed to be about. And I think you touched on, as you were just speaking, you touched on the fact that we got to lead with beauty. And you spoke to that in your talk too. And having been a Word on Fire Institute member since the beginning, I know that that's a huge part of the culture of Word on Fire, and the approach that Bishop Barron takes. But for you, in a particular way, share a little bit of how you see the beauty within Bruce Lee being a master evangelist. Share a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a couple of different aspects to that. One would be just the cinema itself. He made very few movies, yet he is a legend in Hollywood. He created the pretty much martial arts genre as we know it today. There were still some limitations given camera work and different things, whenever he was making them. But the idea of sort of the warrior's journey, as we know it in regard to martial arts, that was Bruce Lee. He brought that, to Hollywood. So that's one piece of it. And another aspect of it is a general love of culture, and regardless of who gets involved, he wants them in it. So something that he kind of broke the mold, particularly in San Francisco and a couple other places where he was teaching. He didn't care if you were Chinese. He didn't care if you were white or black or woman or man, or he knew he had something that would help people in their life through self-discipline, self-awareness, and of course self-defense, because it's martial arts. But he knew he had something great that he could use this culture to bring people together with a mutual love. To me, that's being a Socratic figure in history of, let's both find this thing together. His whole ethos of Jeet Kune Do, which is his martial art, the way of no way, in large part because the truth is what we're all aiming for, but each of us are going to find that truth in our own capacity, in our own path. Now, this isn't kind of like up the mountains, to the same place. It's more of, how do you live out the art of self-defense? How do you live out the art of self-awareness and self-gift, really? And so that, as you said, that's going to look very different depending on your passions, depending on what you love. But also in him, just him as a person is a fascinating figure, because, if you watch him in his movies, everybody knows him as this kind of high-kicking, fighting guy with the blood on him and all that kind of stuff. And that is a huge part of who he was. But if actually you watch the parts where he's not fighting, he's a total gentleman. And he's a very humble, self-giving person. There's even a couple of kind of risque moments in those films that he feels awkward and wants to kind of like leave. It's not like he, is trying to use this person or anything. It's actually, I mentioned in my talk, I kind of said he's like a lion and a lamb. kind of combined into a person where, depending on the situation, you better believe he's going to stand up for what's right. But most of the time, he was gentle, and he was just there to help, and he just wanted to, help people thrive and stand up against tyranny. And so I thought that, he just provides such an interesting piece, because he's also somebody who wasn't necessarily Christian or particularly Catholic, although he does have some Catholic background in his own upbringing. So he's somebody that I think, especially for Christians, that can appreciate certain aspects of what he gave on the screen, his own philosophy of life, his own philosophy of self-discipline, these different things, in a way in which we can speak to non-believers. So non-believers love, if you go to any UFC event, Bruce Lee's probably going to come up at some point, or a martial arts film. Bruce Lee's probably going to come up. So he creates this kind of bridge between a believer and a non-believer, that you can both love the beauty of who he was and the movies that he created, and do the Socratic thing of like, now let's point both at the truth of what he's revealing. And as Christians, we can say, I'm going to go through your door, but you're coming out mine. So I just think that there's so many different aspects to Bruce Lee that I think we should learn a lot from.
Yeah, everything that you're talking about is what Pope Francis speaks of, about, in the sense of accompaniment, to come alongside, to be able to come to understand, to truly listen and to understand. And, it's something of, and then to be able to have the strength of your own self and knowledge of yourself, that you're able to point them and say, hey, what you're talking about, this is actually known by this in another name. I can't help but think of all the time, I'll talk to people about C.S. Lewis and his Chronicles of Narnia, and there's such beautiful analogies there. And it's the same thing of where it's just like Aslan, of course, the Christ figure in the Chronicles, it's like, he tells us, Aslan speaks it, to the children, you'll have to come to find me by another name in your world. And so often we'll step into the worlds, the cultures of other people, and because we ourselves aren't sure of who we are, then we doubt that what it is that we're seeing is actually, no, that's good, and that can help you come to the truth, who is the truth. But we hesitate, and I think for me, Bruce was such a person of courage, in so many ways. Just having to be a person of courage, in the face of what was blatant discrimination, and exclusion, and yet it didn't stop him. He didn't sit there and cry in his Wheaties and kind of go, oh, woe is me, I can't get a break. Rather, he did the work, and then he eventually comes back.
Yes.
To be able to and that time, I call it his time in the desert. Of where all of that then came, and we benefited from that because we got to see literally a master at work, and not kind of like the tries that were leading up to that. So yeah, it's one of those of where I see such courage. I made mention of it to you before we jumped on, about the fact of I remember the article that you wrote back in 2017 about what Bruce Lee taught you about evangelization, and then as you were getting ready to prepare this talk, how is it that some of what you shared several years ago and what you shared in your talk, are they this exact same, or have they differed a little bit? How are they, how has it changed?
Yeah, part of that, the change would be coming to a greater understanding of the Word on Fire ethos over those years, understanding Bishop Barron's own mind in regard to culture and things. Bruce Lee, some of that kind of more early stuff, it was trying to understand the reality that within evangelization, you're dealing with a human person. So an entire kind of humanistic perspective of a person in front of you. Something as easy as common language. When we're talking about a martial arts world, there's certain lingo that if you can connect with people on a linguistic basis, now you've got a commonality between each other that you can now kind of guide. And so some of the early things that I thought about with Bruce Lee was he provides, again, through martial arts, this kind of common human experience that people can come together and just appreciate and love and build each other. And something that I've always loved in sports, or particularly in healthy sports environments, is you're constantly pushing each other to be better. That's part of being on a team, is you help each other. You don't put each other down. You let the coach kind of do the coaching, but as athletes, you come together and help each other. And Bruce Lee was a phenomenal model of that. And I think that the Catholic Church particularly needs to learn a lot of that kind of language of just helping people. But then over time, and particularly maybe through my studies of Thomas Merton, trying to understand how it is that evangelization of the culture being one of our principles of the ethos, how we get even deeper into the ways in which a person like Bruce Lee can provide, to get back to that kind of common language thing, can provide a lens for us to understand what good evangelization looks like, particularly with cultural realities. So, for example, he was basically a Taoist. And one of the principles of the Tao, I've mentioned this in my talk, is this idea of true and false self. And Thomas Merton kind of Christianized that. He built on that and actually showed how, in light of the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we're going through a very similar reality. It's not necessarily fully a Buddhist or a Taoist understanding of that, but to use that same language, well, now you're leading through the culture and growing. So I think part of it too is just my own formation. I grew over a matter of 4 or 5 years, and a little more better understanding of philosophical language and stuff like that. But that I just think there's such a mind, and I really wanted to hold up Bruce Lee as an example of somebody who in the modern world was able to reach the modern ear. And that's something that honestly Catholicism and Christianity in general is struggling with right now. How do we do that? How do we reach the modern ear? And I think there's numerous figures like him, and Bishop Barron uses Bob Dylan, I'm using Bruce Lee, these different people that have helped influence the culture in a positive sense. How is it they're doing it? And how is it that a Catholic can take that same strategy and do it in a much fuller sense, because we have the fullness of the truth. But it's a pedagogical kind of strategy with a person. So say, for example, I know somebody at a jiu-jitsu gym who doesn't believe in anything, but is total materialist, but he loves jiu-jitsu. Okay, well, pedagogically, I'm going to start there. I'm going to start with just a love of the game, start with a love of probably mutual love of Bruce Lee, more than likely, and then grow from there. And so you're leading with the beauty of the sport itself, but then you're thinking about the culture and the common language and how you can grow together. So you're getting into that humanistic reality of just me with another human person on a human level connecting. And sometimes people tend to, and granted, it's out of good intentions, but sometimes people come really strong with the faith very early, and a lot of times people just aren't ready for that. And sometimes, and I think this is where Bruce Lee provides yet another example of start with the beauty of a film before you actually get into what was his philosophy of life. You get to actually just see it. You get to experience it. You get to kind of human moment of connection. And then over time, you start to convey. It's much like the monastic life. You have this moment of getting in, but it takes time and a lot of chipping away at the falsities that we have. And so I know I got off on a little bit of a tangent there,
No,
but
not at all.
there's just a lot to get into.
No, totally. And I'm glad you brought up Merton, because that was going to be something that I was going to ask of, how your studies of Merton have influenced you. And, so you actually did an entire course in the Word on Fire Institute on it, and beautifully done, by the way.
Thank you.
So I think so often we hesitate because we're thinking, oh, I'm going to be corrupted in some way, or I'm going to lose my way. And that's why I absolutely love, one of the principles, in fact, of the Word on Fire is the fact of, you're grounded in the Eucharist, and it's affirmative orthodoxy, and it's, the fact of it's unwaveringly Christocentric. So if you're focused on Christ, you're not going to lose your way. but so often we hesitate because we're like, oh well, I can't, and I respect it. I mean, we don't want to bring scandal to people. We don't
Sure.
want to mislead others. But when we are clear about the fact of our love, so like you're talking about jujitsu, your friend, jujitsu friend, where I love jujitsu, and nothing says that because you love jujitsu that means you love Christ less.
Right. Right.
So I think it's so important for us to remember that love is not, limited. There's not a scarcity of it. And when we are immersed in love itself, then all the things that bring that together, then we're pointing it towards all of who truth is. And that's what the transcendentals are. So
Yeah.
you were just talking, you went down a rabbit hole, and I just did myself. So my apologies as well.
But it's a good point, because I think that what the potential fear comes from is maybe a lack of thinking that we know enough to get into those kinds of things. So, for example, if somebody asked me about, what book should I read of Thomas Merton, particularly in regard to how he dealt with Buddhism,
Right.
and I always say, well, if you haven't read Seven Story Mountain, you really shouldn't get into, say, Zen and the Birds of Appetite yet, because you need to know what he was doing, and you need to know what his process was and how he got into there. Because once he got into that, he was comfortable enough to use common language. He was comfortable enough to try to find those little seeds of the word that to some who may not have understood his project might look scandalous. But to someone who, say, for example, is, with my jujitsu friend or whatever, at that moment, I'm not watering down the faith by starting with the simple desire for competitive spirit. I'm not watering it down. I'm recognizing where this person is on the pedagogical scale, because I know that to start there, I can't all of a sudden, ask him if he believes Jesus was divine or not, because it's a non-starter, really. And it might actually end the conversation for him, because he might just be like, I don't want to talk about that stuff. But if you start there, and then you start inviting him over to the house for a barbecue, and then you start with those kind of human common experiences, and then as trust builds, that's when you can start saying, by the way, my faith is very serious to me. I take it very serious, and would you mind if I pray with you? And something as simple as that. That kind of moment, but in order to get comfortable with that, you do have to know the tradition. You have to know Augustine. You need to know, Boethius even, and several others, but not be beholden to it. Not be fearful of things that aren't perfectly in line with the tradition, but knowing it well enough so that you can kind of be nimble within the modern context.
Yeah, I shared this before. I did something similar, especially at the height of the Harry Potter, fandom. And I actually went to Harry Potter conferences and spoke about the life of virtue as portrayed in Harry Potter. But I had such phenomenal conversations with people who I don't know, because I haven't been in touch with them, of course, but it's something of where they would just be like, wow, I never thought about that. And it's just like, and I'm just like, Lord, whatever seed has just got planted, go to work, But that's our responsibility, is to plant the seeds, or to till the soil, or to add water. And as you said, wherever they are, we have to become masters at that, pedagogical evangelization, of being able to say, okay, this is where I need to be, and to be comfortable with that, and to not, like beat ourselves up and go, oh, gee, I didn't invite them to mass. And it's like, it's not time to invite them to mass yet.
Yeah, I always think
barbecue.
Yes, exactly. My confirmation saint is St. Francis of Xavier, and I always think about the fact that he used to dress. Yeah, he used to put on the dress of the people that he would go evangelize. He was literally kind of camouflaging himself into the culture because he loved the people in front of him enough to not come and kind of beat them over the head with something, but rather meet them on a common ground. And I know there's a little bit of a fear that people think that that's watering it down, but no, it's a strategy. It's the whole gentle as doves, wise as serpents reality that like I'm coming in through this gentle moment, and I'm going to appreciate and love you for where you are and where you're at. But I'm going to slowly kind of create these times and moments where I can kind of start to create a little bit of a conversion experience for you. And it's not to, use people for a strategy or to win souls or anything, but it's because you love Jesus and you want everybody to know him. But we've got to do it strategically. And we have great examples in the saints.
No, absolutely. I love the fact that Francis Xavier is a patron. He's one of my Francises, as I say. So he and Francis de Sales, but Francis Xavier, you're aware. Do you know the story about Francis and the crab? And
No.
oh shoot. After we get off, I'll have to get your address so I can send you the pin.
Okay.
But no, you go to the Gesù in Rome, and they have these little pins, and it's a picture of it's a small little crab, but he's holding a cross. And the story behind that is that you, of course, know Francis Xavier desired greatly to get to mainland China, and tried many, many times to get there, and eventually he died off the coast. Well, one of the times they were trying to get there, a huge storm, came up, and he's, laying in the back of the boat, kind of similar to Jesus. And the fishermen are kind of going, oh my gosh, we're going to die. And he wakes up and he actually takes his crucifix and he holds it up and he asks the Lord to calm the storm. And the storm comes, but in the process, he drops his cross in the ocean. Well, they get back to shore, and as they're dragging the boat onto shore, and they're kind of going, praise God, we're back on dry land. And they look down the beach, and out of the ocean comes this crab carrying the cross.
Wow.
and it's just like, regardless of whether or not, it's a story or whatever. But the fact is that it's just that beautiful reminder of God's care for all of us, even in the smallest of things. But anyway, I digress. And so you are so right. I really believe that one of the most fundamental things that we could share with the faithful is kind of what this pedagogical evangelization looks like, what that evangelization cycle kind of looks like, so that we can be strategic. I talk to people about, it's to encounter them and then to engage with them, and then it's to accompany them, and then you mentor them. And throughout all of this is those times of when they're growing, closer, in human friendship. And it's a holistic perspective. Thomas Aquinas, of course, says you build the supernatural on the natural. So it's like, if we don't have a relationship with someone, we're not going anywhere. We can't invite them to anything because they're like, why am I going to come up to your house? I don't know you, let alone go to some strange, thing where you guys eat somebody's, flesh. And, it's like, I've heard strange things about you Catholics. So anyway, but I really long for people to be able to just kind of have it in their mind. This is the process. And then, okay, this is where this person is. And, so I love your quick thought on, I talk many times about the fact that the church, for lack of a better term, sucks at mystagogia. We're great at getting people, even getting people to the sacraments. We're great at that. But then afterwards, it's like, okay, you're on your own.
Yes.
And I'm like, what are we doing? No, this is the time that now we come together and we continue to mentor and accompany one another. We get to rejoice together, eat at the banquet table together, and we're kind of like, okay, take care. But what are your thoughts in the work that you're doing in Word on Fire? What do you think might be some ways that we can get better at that component in particular?
Yeah, I think in large part, and it's been an interesting year with COVID and everything that has put a big hiccup in how we communicate with other persons. Even in the U.S. in the suburbs and stuff, most people don't know their neighbors at all. They never talk to them, and they just kind of stick to their own. And I some people may just be shy and stuff like that, and that's a different style that they might have. But the ability to just connect with human persons again, and just have good conversations with people, open up your own heart with people, and not be fearful of judgment or judging others or anything like that. I think that's part of the reason why we suck at mystagogy, because mystagogy, again, is about now you're in the faith with us, so celebrate with us as another human person. We forget that. And I know it's not necessarily taking the focus away from the importance of the faith, but now you have a human person in front of you. And so you get to celebrate the faith together, you get to grow in the faith together and grow in your spiritual life together. But same thing, the pre-evangelization moment, like a lot of that actually is just human connection and trust. Very rarely is it going to be some, apologetic strategy, which we need those, but very rarely is that actually going to be step one for somebody. Usually it's going to be, I trust this person, I know they love me. Therefore, whenever they bring up the faith, they're clearly not trying to get some kind of end result. They're just trying to show me something that they love, which is why things like culture help, because in pre-evangelization and in mystagogy, I think, we were very good at sacramentalizing people, but those kind of bookends, we're not real good at those. And pre-evangelization, I think, particular to culture, that's human connection ultimately. Part of my love of Bruce Lee also is I love Eastern philosophy. Fulton Sheen actually once said that as soon as we recognize that Confucius was much like Socrates, we'll start to appreciate the East for what it is. And I think that many ways you can use those little moments of connection, regardless of what philosophy it is. You can find moments of truth, because that's how you can connect with another human person in front of you. But I think that's one part of it. Another part of it is people should not be fearful of going deep into knowing the faith. I know there's a lot there, and there's, it's a very, very deep well that, even Thomas Aquinas, as he's about to die, wanted to burn everything that he wrote, because there's just so much that we will never, dry out that well. But for you to spend 20, 30 minutes a day in prayer, scripture, and maybe an intellectual read of some kind, I think that we should all challenge ourselves to get back into my sports life. That's how you build. That's how you grow muscle. Is you've got to tear down the muscle to begin with, and it's a painful process. Same thing in the mental life and the intellectual life. To get to the place where you can start speaking philosophy or theology on a decently high level, it takes a lot of work to get there, but it's worth it. It's worth it in the end. And so to not be fearful of that, but rather dig into it, because then this whole idea of pedagogy, the more you know about the faith, the more you know about culture and literature and poetry and all these kind of humanistic studies, the more you can start to recognize where a person's at. So you can see, like, okay, right now might not be the time where I bring up Aquinas, but it might be a time to bring up John Donne, or it might be a time to bring up Harry Potter or something like that. That eventually I'm going to get them to start talking about Aquinas, but right now I know where they're at, So to not be fearful, I think, of the intellectual life as well.
Absolutely, because and I can't believe our time is already gone, but it's a beautiful way for us to end our conversation, in the sense that when we are able to recognize and not be afraid, then we truly allow ourselves to be instruments of the Holy Spirit. And when we really, recognize that the Holy Spirit is going to give us the words to say, is going to prompt us, is going to continue to form us, so that all of what we're reading or studying and meditating on, in prayer, all of that becomes part of ourselves, and then we just share it. We don't think about it, but instead we just share it, because it's the essence of who we are, which is, part of the truth, which of course is God. I just have so enjoyed our conversation, Jared. Thank you
I
so
did as
much.
well. This has been great.
Yeah. For everybody out there, I hope that you've enjoyed our conversation today. Jared, just very briefly, if they want to connect with you or Word on Fire, or learn more about Word on Fire, where might they go?
Yeah, so wordonfire.org is, of course, our main website. There you can find out more about Bishop Barron and everything that he is doing. And if you want to learn more about the Institute, if you go to wordonfire.org, there's a tab right there to learn more about what we do at the Institute, which, as you know, it includes courses and a journal and online community, and we've got a lot more big stuff coming. So it'd be great to have all of your listeners in with us.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. So everybody, thanks for joining us today, and know my continued prayers and hope that as you continue to journey on this life of faith towards holiness, that you continue to do whatever it takes to be able to become the saint that God created you to be. God bless, and talk with all of you again soon.